Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a genuinely fascinating and honestly deeply relevant subject. We're looking at the intense intersection of narcissistic personality traits, political leadership, and the decay of democratic institutions. I mean, think about it. What actually happens when an individual's deep psychological need for grandiosity collides with the ultimate levers of state power? To answer that, we'll be drawing on some highly critical source material to unpack the psychological theory of the political narcissist. And then, as you'll see, we'll explore how the author of our source text applies this exact framework to a very specific, real-world case study. So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Defining political narcissism. 2. The blueprint for power. 3. The cost of institutional decay. 4. A case study on Abiy Ahmed. 5. Governance, centralization, and conflict. And finally, 6. Safeguarding democratic institutions. Let's jump right in. Section 1. Defining political narcissism. Let's look at the psychological profile here and honestly ask ourselves why political systems seem to act as these giant magnets for these specific traits. Okay, let's dive into this. Our source material actually breaks narcissism down into 2 primary modes. On one side, you have grandiose narcissism. This is the stuff you usually picture: high self-esteem, dominance, overt exhibitionism. These are the incredibly charismatic campaigners who use soaring rhetoric to build massive, personality-centered movements. But on the flip side, we have vulnerable narcissism. This one is defined by hypersensitivity to criticism and defensive hostility. While these folks might not always be the ones standing at the front of the parade right away, they mask their deep insecurities through hypervigilance and the constant, relentless persecution of anyone they perceive as an enemy. But here's the thing. In politics, narcissism rarely exists in a vacuum. Our source material explains that it frequently correlates with 2 other incredibly dangerous traits: Machiavellianism, which is essentially strategic, calculating manipulation, and psychopathy, characterized by impulsivity and a really distinct lack of remorse. When you get these 3 traits converging in a political leader, you get what's known as the dark triad. It's a highly dangerous psychological nexus. This constellation creates a leader who doesn't view state institutions as entities meant to serve the public, but literally just as tools to be leveraged for their own personal legacy, power, and protection. Section 2. The blueprint for power. Let's examine how these leaders actually acquire power and ask the big question: why do voters consistently reward these exact traits at the ballot box? Well, the text outlines a sequential playbook for exactly how this happens. Step 1 is charismatic signaling. Narcissists are absolute masters of impression management. Voters consistently misinterpret their unshakable, grandiose self-belief as actual competence and decisive strength. Step 2 is the politics of polarization. These leaders excel at creating intense us versus them narratives. By positioning themselves as the sole defender of a specific group against some sort of malignant other, they secure this fiercely loyal, almost cult-like following. And finally, step 3, risk-taking and boldness. Their psychological tendency toward impulsivity is often completely rebranded as boldness, which fools voters into thinking this leader is uniquely capable of rapid, transformative change. Section 3, the cost of institutional decay. Let's shift gears and look at the actual governance costs when one of these narcissistic leaders takes office. Right off the bat, the first major casualty is objective truth. It gets entirely replaced by what the text calls the narcissistic bubble or the echo chamber, because that grandiose self absolutely must be protected from criticism at all costs. The leader starts viewing any normal institutional checks and balances as a personal insult, so they dismantle civil service neutrality, purge dissent, and replace objective experts with loyal sycophants. The only information allowed into the bubble is information that confirms the leader's pre-existing brilliance, which, as the source points out, inevitably leads to catastrophic policy errors. And these internal psychological needs, they don't just stay at the top. They ripple out to damage the entire society in 3 really severe ways. First, public cynicism just skyrockets, mostly because the leader prioritizes public spectacle way over substantive policy. Second, social fragmentation deepens. To maintain dominance, the leader constantly seeks conflict, using populist rhetoric to basically pit citizens against one another. And third, diplomatic instability. Diplomacy requires nuance, compromise, and empathy, things the narcissist fundamentally lacks. Therefore, international relations completely devolve into a zero-sum game, which ends up destabilizing alliances and the global order as a whole. Okay, so we've laid out the psychological framework: the grandiosity, the dark triad, the echo chambers, the polarization. But theory only takes us so far, right? So how does this theoretical model actually apply to a real-world leader? Section 4, Case Study, Abiy Ahmed, Applying the Framework. Here, we're going to pivot directly into the source text's highly critical analysis of the Ethiopian Prime Minister, impartially reporting the author's specific claims to understand their view of this geopolitical crisis. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds historically. According to the text, back in 2018, Abiy Ahmed ascended to power following the immense sacrifices of the Cairo Revolution, which ousted the previous regime. Initially, he was heralded globally as a massive, transformative figure. In fact, in 2019, he was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his initiative to end a border stalemate with Eritrea. However, the author argues that by late 2020, Abiy utilized incredibly aggressive lustration tactics to dismantle the influence of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. This marked a sharp shift into a militant posture that, according to the source, culminated in devastating civil wars. Section 5. Governance, Centralization, and Conflict. Let's dig deeper into the author's critique here. To really understand the severity of the source's claims, take a look at this direct quote. The author states, henceforth, his alleged prosperity party has been compared to mafia rule, built up on absolute hierarchy, tools of control and exploitation of resources. The text aggressively accuses the administration of severe human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, and ethnic cleansing. And it explicitly attributes these actions to a regime that is desperately clinging to power through structural control and violence, which, the author argues, is exactly what the theoretical model of the political narcissist predicts. The author also focuses heavily on the impact on the Oromo people and the Oromia region. According to the specific claims laid out in the text, Oromia is described as the richest land, which carries at least 3/4, or 75%, of the burden of what the author provocatively calls the predatory settler colonial Abyssinian Empire. The author argues that geopolitical interests have consistently supported a centralized state at the deep, deep expense of the specific region, effectively turning it into a zone of severe humanitarian crisis. Furthermore, the text highlights a really stark shift in the leader's rhetoric. The author claims that the state, under Abiy, frames long-standing conflicts not as standard political disagreements that require diplomatic nuance, but as literal, existential, life-or-death struggles against traitors and weeds. This directly connects back to our earlier discussion on the politics of polarization. By actively dehumanizing opponents, the leader creates the ultimate us versus them narrative. According to the source's psychological framework, that is a textbook maneuver for maintaining total control. Section 6. Safeguarding democratic institutions. So, what are the author's mitigation strategies? How do we defend against this? So, the crucial point is, we must actively build defenses. The source outlines 3 definitive strategies for mitigation. First, institutional fortification. We've got to strengthen independent oversight bodies and the judiciary to physically prevent the centralization of power. Second, media literacy. We desperately need a public capable of discerning between a leader's performative grandiosity and actual, substantive policymaking. And third, standardizing transparency. We absolutely must force rigorous public record-keeping. You see, transparency acts as literal kryptonite to the narcissist's echo chamber, forcing accountability even upon the most self-obsessed actors. Which leaves us with this final, pretty massive thought. We've seen the psychological theory, and we've explored a highly critical case study of how these traits allegedly manifest in catastrophic, real-world decay. If our political systems naturally act as giant magnets for narcissists, what is your role as a voter, a citizen, and an observer of the global stage in ensuring that power remains a tool for human progress, rather than just a monument to a single leader's ego? It's a completely vital question to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the dynamics of leadership around you. Catch you next time.